Hey there, welcome back. So last week we took a brief look at some of the standard ethical theories. Hopefully it has given us some vocabulary to debate the ethical issues to come. Today we kind of zoom in a little bit and take a look at two dominant methods of moral judgment in bioethics. So let's get started. There are generally two ways to resolve difficult moral dilemmas in a clinical setting. The traditional way, which is kind of gradually falling out of favor, is called principlism. Those who make use of this particular method try to apply general principles to particular cases. So in the last chapter, we examined a few principlist schools of thought, including utilitarianism, Kantianism, and Rossian ethics. But the classic standard approach in bioethics is popularized by Tom Beauchamp and James Childress in the 1970s, called the Four Principles of Bioethics. The four principles of bioethics are non-maleficence, beneficence, respect for autonomy, as well as justice. Now, these principles are prima facie, meaning that in situations where they do not conflict with one another, we have the moral obligation to respect all four principles. However, in particular cases, they can sometimes come into conflict, and so we would have to use practical reason or moral discernment to decide how we should proceed. So before we get into that though, let us talk a little bit more about the first three principles. We're going to kind of leave justice behind for now and for another time. So let's get started. So number one, respect for patient autonomy. Autonomy generally refers to every person's ability to act on her beliefs, values, and plans of life. And this also includes the ability to critically assess and to revise our currently held beliefs and values and so on. Since autonomy is an ability, people need help to develop it. For instance, through education, through discipline or moral formation. And people also might lose it, say in a comatose patient. Now, autonomy has not always been an important value in medicine, as well as in many cultures today. Prior to the 20th century, medical professionals behaved pretty paternalistically towards their patients. Doctors, for instance, thought that they alone knew what was best for the patients, and the patients, for the most part, complied with the doctor's directions and instructions. Since then, however, autonomy is generally considered to be a good safeguard against abuses of power. The importance of autonomy is generally attributed to the German philosopher we talked about last week, Immanuel Kant, who believes that rational agency has a kind of inviolable dignity, right? That means that we should all have the freedom to decide for ourselves what is good for us. And so it follows that we should also respect that ability in other people. This idea, however, also has Christian precedents. For instance, for many Protestant reformers, such as Martin Luther, they used a particular biblical text in Romans 2:15 to develop what is called a theology of conscience. The text reads, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts and their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them and at other times even defending them. This means that for many Christians, the ability to do what we think is right is a sacred right it needs to be protected from any kind of arbitrary interference. This does not mean, however, that autonomy has no limits, as we will see. Autonomy gives the patient three rights. The right to form beliefs about what is acceptable or unacceptable healthcare in accordance with their own worldview, whether it be religious or secular. And number two, the right to request treatments and therapies in accordance with their plans and wishes. And number three, this is very important, they have the right to refuse treatment. Now, in order for patients to exercise their autonomy, however, there are certain conditions. Number one, the providers have to educate the patient about their own condition, as well as to explain to them in a language that they can understand their treatment options, as well as the risks that is involved. Number two, patients have to be in a mental state that is capable of giving lucid reasons for their actions. And number three, patients have to be relatively free from any kind of institutional coercion, either or through family or economic pressures, and as well as any kind of condition that might involve cognitive impairment, such as if they're under the influence of particular substances or they're suffering from schizophrenia, for instance. Patient autonomy, however, can sometimes conflict with the public good, for instance, in cases of required vaccination programs. The welfare of others, as well as the conscience of providers, such as in the case of abortion or euthanasia, can conflict with our freedom sometimes. So in these cases, patient autonomy may give way to more important considerations. Providers have to be compassionate towards their patients and listen to their concerns, because providers are not merely providing a commodity, namely healthcare, but healthcare is a social good in terms because providers are sometimes the public's only access to needed care, right? So there's an important dimensionality to healthcare that is not reducible to just being a market commodity. Non-maleficence stipulates that in general, providers should not cause needless harm to the patient. Now, harm is here technically defined as any significant setback to a person's interests. Now, what is considered a person's interest? Well, in this case, it includes any kind of subjective preferences, plans, as well as physical well-being, medically defined, of course. So, for instance, medical procedures that offer no benefits, but can cause a patient great suffering, disfigurement, or mental distress, or even social alienation, are considered harmful, right, or undermining the interest of the patient. So providers have a duty to avoid doing harm to patients. What goes along with non-maleficence is the professional obligation as well, to be up to date with the current knowledge and skills required to carry out the latest medical interventions. So providers have the obligation to keep up with current scientific knowledge so that they can serve them in the most responsible way possible. While non-maleficence commits us to avoid harm, the principle of beneficence obligates us to do positive good to our patients. Now, this might include the duty to take steps to remove the possibilities to prevent future harm, if it is not too late to do so. For instance, after Duke University Hospital faced the incident where a patient died from negligence during an organ transplant surgery, the entire system took steps to improve the procedures in order to avoid future errors like that. In a hospital or medical setting, the duty of beneficence also obligates the providers to maximize a patient's welfare, including a patient's physical and psychological well-being. But this raises the question of whether beneficence ever justify the curtailment of someone else's freedom or autonomy. When beneficence trumps autonomy, we have a case of what is called paternalism. It is called paternalism because it is analogous to the relationship between a parent and a child. A parent is responsible for the well-being of the child since the child lacks the ability to take care of herself or to make informed decisions about complicated matters. So few people would take issue when a parent disciplines a child by limiting her freedom to do what she wants or to pursue her own life plans. But things get a little bit more tricky when paternalism is shown by an adult or an institution to other adults. In medicine, it is generally assumed that the patient should make decisions about treatment options and interventions because the patient is the one who will bear the consequences. So providers are not generally in a position to make what is called quality of life judgments, right? We do not get to decide what makes another person's life worth living, right? But this is not to say, though, that providers cannot sometimes try to persuade patients to make certain choices, right? Or to talk about the pros and cons of different treatment options with them. They should, right? But so autonomy is not absolute. If a patient is not competent or if the demands of the public good is sufficiently grave, then sometimes autonomy can and should be limited. There's also another model of doing bioethics, one that doesn't necessarily rely on the application of principles to particular situations. This case-oriented model is called casuistry. Casuists read a moral judgment by looking at the morally salient features of a case and by comparing it with similar or analogous cases that were decided in the past, either by courts or by other clinical ethicists. So take a look at the case in the reading assignment. A Jehovah's Witness, mother of 7, decided to reject the use of blood transfusion during a risky surgical procedure. Right? As you know, Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in blood transfusions for theological reasons. Now, the mother is deemed competent by the people who are involved, but she's also, however, the primary breadwinner of the family. So if she were to die from this surgical procedure, which is very likely should we let her refuse blood transfusion, then the welfare of her 7 children would be in serious jeopardy. So in this case, we see the two principles, respect for a patient's autonomy, clearly conflicts with a provider's duty to protect the welfare of her children. So 2 norms are now coming into conflict. So the provider feels very uneasy about either respecting the autonomy of the patient or simply just considering the welfare of the children. So casuists would look at cases like this. Instead of just looking at abstract principles, they would take a look at previous court cases or clinical ethical cases that's been decided in the past and see how those might illuminate this particular case. So if the casuists find a particular precedent applicable, so for instance, if a previous court decision ruled against the parent's choice or autonomy in favor of the welfare of the children, then that previous case would seem to suggest that if we applied that case to this particular situation, that it would be morally justified for the clinical ethicist or the provider to rule in favor of the welfare of the children and against the autonomy of the mother. So, this is all we have for today. I hope you will enjoy this week's discussions. I'll see you next time.